happens is that there's no self. There seems to be someone sitting at the front of a room, addressing other people sitting in the room, and declaring that there's no self. It seems a bit counterintuitive, to say the least, but I think we're here maybe to explore the possibility that our intuitions are quite often wrong, particularly when it comes to the most basic, what seems to be fact of existence, which is that I exist as a person living in a world which is separate from me. That seems to be the most basic fact for most of us. It seems self-evident, never to be questioned. I exist as a separate individual, and I live something called my life. I live this story called my life, moving through a world which is separate from me, and meeting up with, and sometimes kind of knocking against, other individuals who are moving through this external thing called the world. And really, the whole purpose of this afternoon, the only purpose of this afternoon, apart from maybe to meet some companionable people, drink some tea, eat a biscuit or two, apart from that, the only purpose of this afternoon is to kind of examine and explore that astonishing statement or that astonishing suggestion. It may not be astonishing, in fact I know it's not astonishing for many of the people sitting in this room. It may not be astonishing for anyone sitting in this room, but by God, you go out there onto Hampstead High Street, you go into Waterstones or Tesco's or Ollie and Steen's if you've got enough money, and start announcing this, and you'll be met with some astonishment, possibly some antagonism as well. I've said before, if you want to start, I can't imagine why any of us would want to start a fight in a pub, but if we did want to start a fight in a pub, one of the quickest, well, at least an argument, one of the quickest ways to do it is to suggest, even suggest that there's no one sitting there holding that cup of water. There's no one sitting there behind that camera. There's no one sitting at the back there with their head to one side. There's no one sitting over there with a backpack at their feet. I mean, this is really an astonishing suggestion. And it seems to run counter to what seems to be my experience of life and our experience of life. But the suggestion from here is that pretending for a moment that there's time, of course there isn't any time, and later on this afternoon we might pick at that one and discuss it, but pretending for the moment that there is time, because I'm kind of spinning a narrative here, I'm spinning a story here, and that always involves time. So pretending for a moment that there is time, the suggestion from here is once upon a time, because this is a kind of fairy story, once upon a time there wasn't that sense of I exist as a separate entity moving through an external world. And that time, of course, is that when we were born and we're very, very young. So you could say what we're talking about here is the possibility of the collapse of duality. I'll come back to that word in a little while, the collapse of duality and the seeing of non-duality. But you could say that in talking about that, in examining that, in looking for it, in yearning for it in some of our cases, what we're really doing in some ways is yearning for that initial state when we were first born. Because the newborn doesn't exist in separation. In other words, the newborn has no sense of itself as separate, whatever the sense of the newborn might be. It's not I am separate from the world which I have apparently been born into. And yet nevertheless, for almost everyone, at a certain age, usually quite a young age, that sense of separation begins to happen. It's like awareness, what we could call maybe just pure awareness begins to separate into awareness of me over here and awareness of everything and everyone else over there separate from me. And when that starts to happen, we could say, okay, now the great adventure of being a person has started. Whatever age it is, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, may be different for different individuals. People argue about what that age might be. It doesn't matter at all. Who cares? For most of us, for almost all of us, that sense begins to arise. I am located in a very, very specific place, and that place is called here, over here. And everything else is located in another place called over there. And there's a space which encompasses both of those things, so I can move through that space as a separate individual. And I can bump up against other separate individuals. And I can have fun with them, I can have joy with them, I can have rouse with them, I can have anger with them, I can have love with them. I can have all sorts of adventures. So this great adventure of being a person, has started at that point. And for most of us, it increases and increases with intensity, and there's never particularly any reason to question what seems to be this absolute reality. This absolute reality, I am separate. Hello. Hello. Yeah. There seems to be no reason at all to question it, partly because all these other apparent people that I come up against or with in my journey through life equally believe they're separate. Depending on what culture I'm born into, I will come across probably, this story, that story, another story, a religious story, whatever it might be, all of which will encourage me in this conviction. I don't want to call it a belief or a conviction or a feeling, because it's all of those three things, but we don't have a word that encompasses all of that. I'll be enveloped, if you like, in other apparent people who are colluding with me, fully believing with me maybe, that I am now a separate individual and I'm in charge of something very important called my life. And out of this arise some very, very important other characteristics, all of which are going to be challenged this afternoon, every single one of which will be challenged this afternoon. So here I am, I'm a separate individual moving through an external world, external to me. I have something called my life, which is a very precious treasure. I have responsibility for that. Oh no, oh my God, I'm only 4 years old and already I've got responsibility for this colossal, precious gem, which I have to carry now, called my life. I have responsibility, and to help me fulfill my might be God-given fate or dharma or whatever it might be, depending on what belief systems I'm introduced to, to help me grow and mature into a fully functioning, wonderful human being whose life works. This is a mythical creature, by the way. A human being whose life works, that's a mythical creature. It's a bit like a unicorn, except I think unicorns might have been spotted a little bit more often than a human being whose life works. So help me on in this task. I might not be given whatever it might be. Beliefs, religious beliefs, political beliefs, beliefs about society, beliefs about responsibility, particularly beliefs about free will. So I'm now living in this external space carrying something called free will and responsibility, and there's something called time that I'm moving through, and I've only got a limited amount of that. We don't know what that will be, but usually it's not much more than about 80 or 90 years, so you better get on and use it well. No wonder some of us might start to be looking rather tired by the time we get to whatever age the tiredness kicks in. We're kind of given these great gifts by the adults around us, you know, beliefs and religious stories and moralities and purpose and all of these good things. We're given these wonderful gifts. It's a bit like, I'm pausing, so I'm just trying to think, which one was it? It was Sleeping Beauty, wasn't it? It was Sleeping Beauty, where the fairies all line up at her birth and give her these wonderful gifts. And then the last fairy, of course, is, well, the wicked fairy. She's not really wicked, she's just a bit put out because she wasn't invited to the christening. So she gives Sleeping Beauty, I believe it's the gift of death, isn't it? And then it's commuted to 100 years of sleep, something like that. So we're given all these wonderful gifts. And at least one of those gifts will be poisonous. And from the list that I've made, like responsibility, for example, religious stories, I suggest that more than one of them is going to be poisonous. Okay, now, there you are. Now get on with it. But I'm only 40 years old. Never mind. Get on with it. Live this life. So the suggestion from here is a really simple one, that all of that, I think there's a technical term for this, let me see if I can remember it, all of that is complete crap. And that can suggest, the importance, it's really important, this is really the only important bit of this afternoon. So once I've said this, you can sort of leave en masse unless you want a cup of tea and a biscuit. You know, the really important thing about that is that it all hangs on this basic premise that there is this certain person. They live in something called time. They're moving from something called the past to something called the future, through something called the present. And perhaps most of all, they have this tremendously precious gift called free will, through which they can make their life work or not work. So having laid that out, now let's forget about all of that. So the suggestion here is a very simple one, that all of that, every single part of it can collapse. Every single part of it can collapse. It can all, to use a phrase I've used before, many other speakers and writers about this have used, it can all be seen through. It can simply be seen through. One way of putting this is that the sense of separation can collapse. It can simply be seen that the one who seemed to be, I'm using this word very carefully, not thought to be, which is just a mental construct, the one who seems to be, is much more than thinking. The one who seems, it's a felt sense being separate, it's a felt sense of the one who seems to be separate. Simply isn't. It can simply collapse. And then it's seen that there's no one here, and because there's no one here, there is no here. So we're on to one of the very challenging things that can be said about this. There's no here and there, there's no space. How can that be? It just seems so obvious that there's space. It seems so obvious that I came from a different place to this one, through other places, and I arrived here today. All those places can only exist because they occupy space. So the suggestion from here is one of the astonishing things that's seen when the person collapses is there's no space, because space is created by the separation of the person from that into this. Because there's a person, there seems to be that out there and this here. And when that collapses, it's seen that there is no space. We could say that awareness is equally everywhere. Awareness is a bit of a weasel word. In some non-duality talks, it's a forbidden word. Anyway, I'm going to use it. If anybody wants to challenge me about it, we'll come on to that, but I'm leaving that up to you. And then another astonishing thing And it can't be explained, this. I mean, you know, it can't be justified intellectually, really. It's just seen. I'm avoiding the word experience because I think experience belongs to the individual, so it can simply be seen that there's no time. If you like, as T.S. Eliot, I think, put it, all time is one time. There is only one time. So in that case, there's no time. There's no past. There's no future. In a sense, there's no present. There is just this. And if you challenge me about that and say, well, if you say there's just this, surely that's the present. I have two options. I think one is to burst into tears and the other is to say we'll come back to that one later as well. So I'll take the second option because I think I can avoid the tears if we do that. So there's no person, there's no time, there's no space. What the hell is there then? What the hell is there? Well, on the most basic level, and without going all kind of spiritual and transpersonal on you, which I might do later, who knows, but on the most basic level, what I'm sure many of you have read, heard other people say, heard me say, and I'm quite sure I'm going to use the word experienced yourselves very inadvisedly. I mean, both words in that phrase are wrong, because there's no experience and there's no yourself, but nevertheless, let's stick with this as if we're just having a casual conversation. As many of you may have experienced yourself. There's just this. There's just whatever is happening. In what? In the timeless presence. In timeless presence. That's not a good phrase, but it's no worse than any of the others. That's all there is. That's all there is. There's no past, no future, no person experiencing this. If there seems to be a person experiencing this, then there's the seeming of that. But there's no person experiencing it, no past, no future. So what the hell is there? What is left? This, whatever's arising in this. And at this point, when I sit down in this chair and start speaking, I never know which direction, this voice is going to take. I never know what's going to kind of come out. But at this point, when we're going in this direction, I usually say, I want to say two things about that. That there is just this. One is that that's a kind of astonishingly ludicrous thing to say to the mind, because the mind, which doesn't actually exist, but we can come back to that later as well, that the mind, which doesn't exist, lives in time, so it seems a ludicrous thing to say to the mind. Of course there's time, I have memory, I have expectation, that's past and future, I'm sitting here, that's the present. So it's a kind of mad thing to say, but equally, or also I would say, in a different way, it's in the realm of the bleeding obvious. That's another technical phrase which I sometimes use if you haven't come across it before. It's in the realm of the bleeding obvious, in a way. I mean, it's a dangerous thing for me now to ask the question and go, isn't it? Isn't it? I mean, maybe someone in here is going to say, well, no, it's not. Well, it may not be to each apparent person in this room, but I'm sure to others it is kind of obvious that it is only this that exists. The past might, you say, oh, the past exists for memory. Yeah, well, where's memory? Only in this. The future might exist as an expectation. Okay. Where's that expectation? Only in this. So in a sense, what we're talking about, I would say, although it sounds very challenging, is absolutely and obviously the case. It cannot, in a way, it cannot be denied that it's the case. Of course, in other ways, the mind will come in and deny it frantically, but in a very fundamental way, there is just this. And when I mean just this, I mean it's timeless. You can't put a time on it. A second? Well, a second has a beginning, a middle and an end. It's just this. I sometimes go into this kind of fanciful little thing here. I'm one of those people, most of us in fact, who understand nothing whatsoever about quantum mechanics. Of course I understand nothing about quantum mechanics, nobody does, but nevertheless I like to read books about it and occasionally kid myself with, well, maybe I did just understand a little tiny bit. You know, there's a sort of little fancy, they have something in quantum mechanics, don't they, called Planck time, which is supposed to be the kind of briefest possible unit of time. Don't ask me what the hell that means. So I like to think that that's what we're talking about here. Maybe, you know, maybe this is Planck time. Who knows? I don't know. We can ignore that. But it's kind of obvious. It's totally challenging in a way, and it's totally obvious in a different way. That's a suggestion from here. So what have we got? We've just got this. We've just got whatever's happening. And the simple suggestion in here is it may be possible for that to be seen, no matter how much this may think it's a person with a past and a future living in time, and a history, and all the other things that go with that. It's possible for that sense to collapse.